Good evening, dear friend. I'm glad you've chosen to spend this quiet hour with me. If you're listening late at night, perhaps unable to sleep, you're not alone. Many of us find comfort in stories that reach back into the past, where the world moved more slowly, where the echoes of history speak softly across time. Tonight, we'll journey into one of the most difficult chapters of the 20th century. Life inside the Soviet Gulag, not told with shouts or harshness, but in the measured rhythm of memory, where the voices of those who endured still linger like faint lantern light in the snow. Before we begin, settle yourself. Dim the lamp, or let the night breeze slip in through the window. If you have a blanket, draw it close. Perhaps there's the hum of a fan nearby, or the soft crackle of a fireplace. These small comforts matter. Take a long, slow breath. Let it out gently. As we begin, I'd love for you to share, if you wish, where you are listening from. Many of you write in from Seattle, from small towns in Maine, from places as far as Stockholm or Sydney. It's a reminder that though we rest in separate rooms, we gather together in the same story. And now, let's step softly into part 1. Beneath ordinary lives, unspoken desires stirred quietly. Imagine a street in Moscow in the late 1930s. By day, it is filled with the ordinary bustle of work and errands. A mother carrying a basket, a man adjusting his scarf against the bite of winter air, children scuffing their boots across a patch of half-frozen mud. On the surface, life appears steady, as if people are concerned with nothing more than the rhythm of the market and the turn of the seasons. But beneath this outward normalcy, a quieter longing pressed in on nearly everyone. The longing was not always named aloud. It was often hidden beneath silence, or pressed into the simple acts of daily life. A father lingering over his child's laughter longer than necessary, knowing tomorrow might bring changes he could not control. A grandmother folding a shawl with extra care, thinking of the family members who had already disappeared in the night. Even the way neighbors greeted each other with quick, cautious nods carried that hidden wish. The wish to be safe, to last one more day, to hold onto a shred of normal life in a world where the rules shifted like wind. Bread was the simplest measure of survival. A small crust saved for the morning meant a chance to face another workday. A loaf kept warm in the crook of an arm could mean life for an entire household. Yet bread was more than food. It became the symbol of everything people quietly longed for: stability, security, the promise that the world would continue in some steady rhythm. At night, in the stillness of crowded apartments, those longings often slipped into whispers. A wife confiding to her husband in the dim glow of a single bulb, "I only hope they don't knock on our door." A child asking if the neighbor who vanished last week would be back soon, and being met with silence. Parents traded glances across tables, careful not to speak too openly, for even walls had ears. The longing extended beyond safety. It was also a desire for dignity, to be seen as human in a world that increasingly measured people as numbers, quotas, units of labor. A quiet clerk at a factory might dream of being recognized, not for the hours worked, but for the songs he once wrote as a student. A young woman, assigned endless shifts at a textile mill, might still keep a secret notebook of poems beneath her mattress, guarding a piece of her soul no system could take. It is tempting, from the safety of our own warm rooms tonight, to imagine these longings as dramatic cries. But in truth, they were often small, nearly invisible gestures. A scrap of paper folded carefully, a lullaby hummed under one's breath, a glance out a window toward the snowy street. Longing lived not in shouts, but in the quietest corners of life. If you close your eyes for a moment, you might picture a man sitting by a frosted window in 1937. His hands are rough from work, his coat worn at the sleeves. Outside, snow falls in gentle silence, muffling the sounds of the city. Inside, his wife mends a torn shirt while their child drifts into sleep. He says nothing, yet his heart is filled with a single unspoken prayer. Let this night pass without the sound of boots on the stair. Let tomorrow be ordinary. Let us remain unseen. This was the silent longing that threaded through households across the Soviet Union. It was not always heroic, nor was it always hopeful. It was, instead, deeply human, the instinct to cling to family, to warmth, to some small anchor in a sea of uncertainty. And though history records the arrests, the trials, the sentences, it rarely records these quiet wishes, breathed in kitchens and stairwells, or carried silently in the lines of a tired face. Tonight, as you rest, perhaps you know that feeling too, the wish for simple peace, the quiet hope that the world outside your door will remain gentle until morning. That same thread of longing stretched across time connects us still. Ordinary corners hold more than they first appear. There is something deeply reassuring about the everyday. A morning kettle, the smell of bread baking, the faint sound of neighbors moving about in the stairwell. These were the small rituals that gave life its texture before the great disruptions arrived. For those who lived through uncertain times in the Soviet Union of the late 1930s and early 1940s, these details mattered as much as any proclamation from Moscow. They were the touchstones by which people measured the shape of their days and perhaps even the measure of their humanity. In a crowded communal apartment, the day often began with the shuffle of feet in shared hallways. One family waited by the door with a bucket, hoping to reach the water tap before the line grew too long. Another tried to claim their turn at the stove, a precious chance to boil tea before the rush. Arguments flared, but more often than not, they faded quickly into resignation. Everyone knew that these small contests were only the surface ripples of a much deeper unease. Yet in the act of boiling water, of breaking bread into cups of weak broth, people preserved the illusion of continuity. An elderly woman named Yelena might have risen early, wrapping herself in a shawl, to sit near the window as the sky shifted from gray to pale white. She would slice an onion slowly, each cut deliberate, stretching what little food she had for her grandchildren. In her silence, there was a form of quiet resistance, the determination to maintain dignity through the ritual of preparing a meal, no matter how thin. Across the hall, a young man could be found polishing his shoes with scraps of cloth, though he had nowhere important to go. The act itself was grounding. In shining the leather, he reasserted control over at least one thing in a life that was otherwise dictated by quotas, orders, and sudden knocks at the door. His shoes would carry him to the factory floor, where hours of monotonous labor awaited. But for a brief time in the morning, he could decide how they looked, how they fit, how they might remind him of better days. Children, too, shaped these corners of daily life. They played in stairwells, their laughter echoing against cracked plaster walls, or slid on frozen patches in courtyards between gray buildings. Their games were often simple: stones, chalk, scraps of string, yet they carried echoes of a world untouched by politics. Parents watched with both relief and dread. Relief, because children's joy was proof that innocence had not yet been extinguished. Dread, because no one could guarantee how long it would last. Even in workplaces, the rhythm of the ordinary persisted. A textile worker might pause at her loom, adjusting the thread with a motion so practiced It seemed almost unconscious. A carpenter in a railway yard sharpened his tools, the rasping sound of metal on stone familiar as breathing. In these small actions, routine survived, like embers glowing quietly beneath ash. There is an old truth. When the world becomes unpredictable, people cling harder to the predictable. In Moscow, Leningrad, and far beyond, the tea poured into chipped cups, the scarves tied before stepping into snow, the whispered lullabies at bedtime. These became lifelines. Each detail anchored life against the tide of fear. If you close your eyes, you can almost step into one of those kitchens. Imagine a narrow table with a cloth worn thin from years of use. On it rests a loaf of black bread, hard at the edges, but still fragrant with rye. Beside it sits a small bowl of sugar, precious and rarely touched, saved for special moments. A samovar hisses faintly in the corner, steam drifting like breath. Around this table gather 3 generations. A grandfather who speaks little, his face lined with worry. A mother who pours tea with steady hands. A child who fidgets, unaware of the tension in the room. The conversation is quiet, measured, careful. Yet beneath it flows the same longing. Let us hold on to this moment. Let the walls stand, the roof shelter, the bread stretch one day further. Sometimes the ordinary was interrupted by the extraordinary, in ways both small and startling. A neighbor might vanish overnight, their room sealed and their belongings confiscated. The sound of boots on the stairwell could silence every conversation in an instant. Yet even then, the next morning the kettle boiled again, bread was cut, children played. Life insisted on itself, even in the shadow of fear. It is worth noting how memory works. Survivors of those years often speak not only of the hunger, the fear, the endless labor, but also of the small details. The exact taste of cabbage soup on a bitter night, the texture of wool mittens passed from mother to daughter, the sound of a familiar song hummed behind closed doors. These memories remind us that even in the harshest conditions, people noticed beauty in fragments. A woman might recall how frost painted delicate patterns on the window pane, each design unique and fleeting. A man might describe the way snow muffled the city's clamor, creating an almost sacred silence before dawn. Someone else remembered the smell of wood smoke drifting through narrow streets, promising warmth in another household even if not in their own. These were the ordinary corners, infused with extraordinary meaning by the circumstances that threatened to erase them. Daily life was, in many ways, an act of quiet defiance. To mend a shirt instead of discarding it, to plant a flower in a chipped pot on a windowsill, to write a letter even when one suspected it might be read by censors, each was a way of saying, I am still here. I am still human. The deeper one looks, the more these small rituals stand out as the true backbone of survival. Large events, arrests, trials, decrees, shaped the framework of history. But the substance of human endurance was built from tea poured, bread sliced, lullabies whispered. They were acts so humble that they rarely made their way into official records, yet they carried more weight than many of the proclamations that echoed through state halls. If you are listening now in your own kitchen or bedroom, you may feel the same truth. The world can seem vast and uncertain, but the cup of tea in your hand, the hum of a fan, the sound of a loved one breathing nearby, these are the ordinary corners that anchor you. The people of another time leaned on theirs as we lean on ours. And so, as part 2 closes, we see how daily life, however fragile, however threatened, created spaces where humanity could still breathe. These corners remind us that history is not only battles and decrees, but also onions sliced slowly in the half-light, shoes polished for no one's eyes but one's own, and the whispered lullaby that carries a child into uneasy sleep. Last meals carry warmth beyond their simple fare. There is something sacred about a meal when one does not know how many more will follow in peace. Across kitchens and barracks, across city flats and village homes, meals carried a significance that far exceeded the meager food on the table. To sit together, to share bread and soup, to hear the scrape of a spoon against a tin bowl, these were rituals of belonging. And when history's machinery threatened to break families apart, these moments became the last fragile threads of ordinary life. Imagine a table at dusk, lit not by electricity, but by the fading light of a window. A bowl of thin cabbage soup sits at the center, steam rising faintly in the cold air. Around the table, people gather, shoulders drawn close, voices kept low. Each spoonful is measured, stretched, shared. Conversation drifts in cautious directions. Talk of weather, of a relative's health, of work quotas. Nothing political, nothing that could be misunderstood. Even within the family circle, words were chosen with care. Yet beneath the quiet talk lay another truth, that this meal might be the last taken together before something changed. Food in these years was never just food. It was currency. It was survival. It was memory. A crust of black bread could mean the difference between fainting at work and enduring another day. A cube of sugar, saved and hidden, was not only a treasure of taste, but a promise of sweetness in a bitter world. Salt, onions, potatoes, these ordinary ingredients took on an almost ceremonial weight. Those who later spoke of the Gulag often remembered not only the hunger that gnawed at them, but the memory of meals before hunger. A woman recalled how her mother used to slice an apple into 6 thin pieces, one for each child, turning scarcity into a gesture of equality. A man remembered the sound of knives on wooden boards, the rhythm of chopping vegetables for borscht in his childhood home, and how that sound lingered in his mind long after the meals were gone. In communal apartments, shared kitchens created a theater of daily endurance. Neighbors moved carefully around one another, protecting small pans, guarding loaves, keeping watch over pots. Arguments arose when a spoonful went missing, or when someone took more than their share of the stove's heat. But there were also moments of kindness. A ladle passed to another family, a portion quietly given to a child not one's own. In these crowded spaces, humanity frayed, but it also shone in unexpected flashes. The last unhurried meals before arrest or exile often became imprinted in memory with unusual clarity. Survivors later described them in exquisite detail: the exact pattern of the tablecloth, the warmth of the cup in the hand, the way candlelight trembled against a wall. One man remembered the final dinner with his wife before he was taken. They had little, just soup and bread, but she had saved a single apple, polished it, and placed it at his plate. He had not eaten an apple in months. That bright, crisp taste became the last sweetness he knew for many years. In labor camps, food shrank into rations measured by weight rather than by nourishment. A piece of bread allotted by grams, a thin ladle of watery soup, sometimes a scattering of fish bones or grains of barley. To those inside, the memory of real meals became a form of torture and also a form of survival. Men recited recipes aloud, women described holiday feasts from memory. Prisoners traded stories of bread rising in ovens, of sausages hanging in smokehouses, of pancakes sizzling in a butter. These spoken meals nourished the imagination, if not the body. There was a paradox in this. Hunger, sharpened memory. The less food there was in reality, the more vivid the memories became. Someone might recall the golden crust of a pie baked in autumn, the way it cracked beneath the knife, releasing steam. Another might describe in detail the pickled cucumbers of their village, crisp and briny, stored in cellars against winter's cold. Such memories were bittersweet. They deepened the ache of hunger, yet they also affirmed the existence of another world, a world beyond the fences and quotas, a world still worth living for. One winter evening, as snow pressed against windows and the stove burned low, prisoners in a barracks began to share aloud the meals they missed most. One spoke of fried onions on rye bread, the smell filling his mother's kitchen. Another described Easter cakes, tall and sweet, dotted with raisins. A third remembered mushroom soup, earthy and rich. Soon the entire barracks hummed with these memories. For an hour, hunger was transformed into community, imagination weaving warmth where none existed. But meals carried darker edges as well. The scarcity bred suspicion, jealousy, even cruelty. A man might hide his bread under his pillow at night, only to find it stolen by morning. Children learned to eat quickly, guarding each bite, eyes darting. The betrayal of hunger was deep. Neighbors who once shared salt now fought over scraps. Yet even in this, the act of eating together remained a fragile sign of hope. As long as people gathered at a table, even a table bare of food, they remembered what it meant to belong. Perhaps the most poignant truth is this: people often remembered not the taste of meals, but the company. A bowl of thin porridge eaten in silence with strangers might fade from memory, but the same porridge eaten beside a loved one in a moment of stillness could echo for a lifetime. The sound of a father's voice, the touch of a mother's hand, the laughter of a child, all gave flavor to meals that otherwise would have been forgotten. If you pause tonight with your own supper in mind, perhaps toast or tea or a simple piece of fruit, you might understand. What matters is less the food than the ritual, the way you hold the cup, the warmth against your hands, the presence of someone nearby. Those who endured the harshest years of the Gulag clung to these rituals as long as they could, for they were the last unhurried meals of ordinary life. In the quiet of night, when hunger gnawed and fear hovered, such memories became more than nostalgia. They became anchors, tying people to a world that still existed somewhere beyond the fences and the frost. Unclear rules shift without warning. There is a particular kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from fear. In the barracks, in the factories, in the small apartments where families pressed close together, silence became the language of survival. Rules were never written clearly. They arrived suddenly, without explanation, like snow in April or frost in May. One day a gesture was harmless. The next, it could bring punishment. In such a world, silence was safer than speech, and uncertainty hung in the air like smoke. Imagine stepping out onto a street where posters shift with each season. Portraits of leaders, slogans about quotas, promises of progress. You pass them on your way to work, not daring to look too long. What was permitted yesterday? Pausing to talk with a neighbor, sharing a joke in line, humming a song, could be dangerous today. People learn to measure each step, each glance, each word. The silence between two people carried entire conversations, caution, warning, weary recognition. Inside the camps, rules bent like branches in the wind. A prisoner could be beaten for walking too slowly one morning, and the very next day be punished for moving too quickly. The guards did not need consistency. They needed control. and control thrived in confusion. When no one knew what was allowed, everyone lived on edge, scanning faces, listening for the slightest shift in tone. In such places, silence became its own kind of knowledge. To remain silent when asked a question, to pause before answering, to let a guard's gaze slide over you without reaction. These small acts of restraint could mean survival. A whispered word, a raised hand, even the wrong expression might mark someone for punishment. And so prisoners learned to school their faces, to keep their eyes on the ground, to breathe quietly, to become nearly invisible. The quiet did not mean the absence of thought. Inside, minds turned endlessly. What does this change mean? Who has fallen out of favor? Why did the rules shift again? But thoughts remained locked behind closed lips. To give them voice was to invite risk. In the long nights of the barracks, the hum of silence was louder than any speech. Men and women lay in rows, listening to each other's breathing, each lost in private calculations about what tomorrow might bring. Sometimes, rules shifted in ways that seemed absurd, almost laughable if not for the cost. One week, mittens were permitted during work. The next, they were forbidden, called luxury. A song sung at dusk could be praised as patriotic one day, punished as subversive the next. A prisoner with medical training might be asked to heal an injured guard in the morning, only to be sent back to heavy labor in the afternoon, as if his skills no longer mattered. The inconsistency was deliberate. It kept people guessing, kept them from settling, kept them too exhausted to resist. Even outside the camps, in ordinary towns and villages, the pattern was the same. A shopkeeper might sell flour freely one week, only to be accused of hoarding the next. A teacher might be encouraged to speak of literature today, then censored tomorrow for quoting the wrong poet. Families hung portraits of leaders on their walls, not out of devotion, but out of fear. Better to be seen obeying than to risk being accused of indifference. Within this fog of shifting rules, people found subtle ways to read the signals. A nod from a veteran prisoner, a gesture from a factory foreman, the look in a guard's eyes. These became the only guides. Knowledge spread in whispers. Today, don't wear that scarf. Or tonight, they're watching closely at the gate. It was an underground code, constantly changing, fragile and dangerous to repeat too loudly. This atmosphere created a particular tension in the body. Shoulders hunched, eyes lowered, steps careful. People carried themselves as though walking on a frozen river, testing each step before placing their weight. The cost of a misstep was not falling into water, but falling into punishment, sometimes brutal, sometimes final. And so every action became deliberate, measured, cautious. Yet there was resilience in this too. To live under such uncertainty required not only fear, but also ingenuity. Prisoners learned to read the moods of guards by the sound of their boots, the way they carried their rifles, the tilt of their heads. Families learned to share information without words, through touches, glances, the passing of objects in a certain order. Children, astonishingly quick, adapted as well. They understood when to be silent, when to vanish into corners, when to avoid questions. One can imagine an evening scene, a long wooden table in a dimly lit barracks. A guard has just left, slamming the door behind him. For a moment, no one moves. The silence is heavy. Then, slowly, one prisoner leans forward and resumes mending a torn glove. Another folds a scrap of paper. Eyes meet briefly, then drop again. Nothing is said, but everyone understands. The rules have shifted again. Tomorrow will be different. They will learn the new boundaries in time, as they always do. The cruelty of such a system was not only in the punishments inflicted, but in the uncertainty itself. To never feel secure, to never know where the line stood, to live with the constant possibility of sudden danger. That was a punishment as grinding as hunger. It eroded trust, weakened friendships, kept people apart. And yet, even here, bonds formed in whispers, in gestures, in shared silences that spoke louder than words. For us, listening tonight in the safety of our homes, it may be difficult to imagine living this way. Our rules, however flawed, are usually written, debated, discussed. We know what is permitted and what is not. But in the world of the Gulag, clarity was a luxury. Silence was the only safe speech, and patience the only safe reply. Small mercies become tools, sharing heat, bread, and stories. Kindness in the Gulag did not arrive with fanfare. It was seldom bold or dramatic. Instead, it slipped quietly through cracks in the system, like a thin stream of light seeping into a darkened room. It lived in gestures so small that an outsider might have missed them entirely. A crust of bread slid into another's hand, a corner of fabric sewn into a makeshift mitten, a whispered word of encouragement when silence felt safer. These small mercies became, in many ways, the key to survival. Imagine a frozen morning. Prisoners march out toward the timberline, the snow crunching under worn boots. The air cuts like glass against skin. In the line, one man stumbles, nearly falling. The guard barks an order to keep moving. For a moment, it seems he will be left behind. Then, without words, the prisoner beside him shifts his own weight, pressing shoulder to shoulder, carrying part of the burden. The guard sees only the march continue, but the stumbling man feels it, an arm steadying him, a kindness disguised as necessity. That single act might keep him alive another day. Kindness was not always gentle in form. Sometimes it was stern, even harsh, but rooted in care. A veteran might snap at a newcomer. Don't waste your strength swinging the axe like that. Pace yourself, or you'll be gone by spring. The words sounded like rebuke, but they carried instruction meant to save a life. Experienced prisoners knew the cost of mistakes. Teaching others, even bluntly, was another way kindness survived. In the barracks, the stove rarely burned hot enough. Fuel was short, wood damp, and drafts cut through the walls. At night, bodies huddled together for warmth. But even in this desperate closeness, kindness emerged. Someone might trade places, giving a weaker comrade the warmer middle spot on the bunk. Another might surrender a rag to block a draft near someone's head. These sacrifices were never grand, but they mattered. They turned the endless night into something just a little more bearable. Bread was the currency of kindness. A day's ration might be no more than a palm-sized piece of black bread, hard at the edges. Yet again and again, prisoners broke that bread in half, or in quarters, or into slivers thin as paper. A man nearing death might give his portion to another, knowing he would not live to eat it. A woman might secretly save crumbs in a cloth for a sick friend who could not march to meals. The bread itself was poor nourishment, but the act of sharing fed something deeper, the conviction that humanity still lived, however faintly. There were other forms of kindness less obvious, but just as vital. A doctor with no medicines might still offer comfort, cleaning wounds with boiled water, whispering reassurance, reminding the sick that they were not forgotten. A teacher, stripped of classroom and chalk, might recite poems in the dark, giving minds a place to wander beyond the camp's fences. A musician, without instrument, might hum a melody under his breath, drawing others into memory. Each of these acts said, in its own way, we are more than the system tells us we are. Of course, kindness carried risk. To share food was to weaken one's own chance of survival. To speak too openly of comfort was to draw suspicion from criminals or guards. Yet people still did it. Why? Perhaps because kindness created a bond stronger than fear. In a place designed to isolate and divide, small mercies knit people together. And together, they endured longer than they might have alone. Consider the quiet ritual of mending clothes. Fabric wore quickly in the endless labor, sleeves frayed, boots tore, mittens thinned. Needles were rare, thread precious. Yet in every barracks there was someone who stitched. A patch here, a seam tightened there. Sometimes they worked by firelight, sometimes by memory in darkness. They charged nothing. They asked nothing. They simply sewed, preserving dignity stitch by stitch. Each repaired coat was a reminder that someone cared whether you froze tomorrow. Stories, too, became a form of kindness. On nights when silence pressed heavy, one voice might rise, soft, steady, telling of life before. Tales of family kitchens, of fields in spring, of trains that carried not prisoners, but students and travelers. These stories cost nothing, yet gave everything. They transported weary minds out of the barracks, if only for a few moments. And in those moments, despair loosened its grip. It is easy to underestimate the power of such small acts when looking at history from afar. Official records are filled with numbers, decrees, arrests. But listen to the memories of survivors, and you will hear a different emphasis. They do not speak only of cruelty and hunger, though those filled every day. They speak, too, of the man who gave them half his bread, the woman who whispered a prayer, the stranger who steadied their arm in the snow. These became the turning points, the reasons someone held on one day longer. Even guards sometimes, against the grain of the system, showed flickers of kindness. A guard might look the other way when a prisoner stooped to pick up a scrap of potato peel. Another might slip an extra ladle of soup without comment. Such gestures were rare and dangerous, but they happened. They reminded prisoners that humanity, though smothered, could never be fully extinguished. And so, kindness became the key. Not a key that opened gates or unlocked chains, but a key that kept the heart alive inside them. Without it, many would have perished, not only in body, but in spirit. With it, even in the harshest winters, people remembered they were still human. If you close your eyes now, perhaps you can picture it. Two figures huddled in the corner of a drafty barracks. One passes a scrap of bread to the other, who hesitates, then accepts. No words are spoken. The guard outside hears nothing. Yet in that moment, the world shifts. A life is lengthened, hope restored, humanity affirmed. That is the power of the kindness key. A day of hushed unity, and one stark reminder of risk. There are moments, even in the bleakest places, when a fragile sense of rhythm settles over life. In the camp, after weeks of punishing labor and unpredictable punishments, the prisoners sometimes found a pace they could endure. Not easy, not kind, but survivable. Work slowed into a rhythm. Meals came with predictable sameness. Nights stretched heavy but steady. In those rare spans, a strange calm hovered, like the pause of air before a storm. At first, it was almost imperceptible. The swinging of axes in the forest fell into unison, the sound measured rather than frantic. Feet marched in lines, not with despairing drag, but with a steady tread. Even the guards, weary themselves, allowed small mercies by neglect, turning their eyes away from every falter, saving their anger for larger displays. To the prisoners, this fragile balance felt like a crest in a sea, otherwise filled with endless waves. They did not call it peace. They did not call it safety. They knew too well that those words did not belong here, but they recognized the rare sensation of endurance made bearable. It was like walking across ice that, for once, held firm beneath their feet. One afternoon, as snow fell with gentle persistence, a brigade worked with quiet determination. They shifted timber, cut logs, cleared tracks. There was no rush, no visible rebellion, just the steady rhythm of survival. A man coughed and was covered by the sound of axes. A woman paused to rest her hands, shielded by the bodies of her comrades. The guards shouted less. For a fleeting time, the camp breathed in unison. In the barracks that evening, there was a hush not of fear, but of tired relief. Men and women sat near the weak stove, mending gloves, sharing whispers, chewing their rations slowly. Someone hummed a tune, soft as breath, and no one silenced it. Heads nodded. A fragile crest, a moment when despair loosened its grip. But it is in such quiet crests that the sharpest shocks often fall. The system did not allow for comfort, however meager, and so, without warning, a blow descended. That night, just as lamps were dimmed, a guard entered. His boots rang against the floorboards. In his hand, a paper, orders from Moscow. He read them without expression. Increased quotas, extended hours, stricter discipline. His words landed like stones in still water, breaking the fragile calm. The barracks, moments ago filled with weary relief, now sank into silence heavy with dread. No one spoke, yet everyone understood what the new orders meant. Longer days, less rest, more beatings. The crest was gone. What had seemed sustainable was revealed as illusion. A single decree erased it. The shock did not arrive in shouts or gunfire. It arrived in the plain, flat voice of a man reading orders, and in the silence that followed. For the prisoners, it was a familiar cruelty. Just when they learned to survive one rhythm, the rhythm changed. It was not only the labor that broke them, but the uncertainty. Later that night, after the guard left, someone sobbed quietly in the corner. It was not the man who had stumbled that day, nor the woman with the worn mittens. It was a trustee, one of the favored prisoners who worked in the office. He had received a letter. His wife, his children, his parents, all arrested, sent to other camps. His cooperation, his loyalty, his small privileges had protected nothing. The shock of it rippled through the room. If even he could lose everything, what safety was there for anyone? The barracks grew colder, though the stove still burned faintly. Each person turned inward, carrying the weight of the revelation. Solidarity might ease the body, but it could not erase the knowledge that the system could strip away families, futures, lives, with the stroke of a pen. And yet, even in that moment, something else lingered. The crest had not been entirely destroyed. The day of quiet rhythm had planted a memory, fragile but real. People had seen what it meant to work together, to endure with subtle defiance. Even when the shock came, they carried that memory inside them. Tomorrow would bring harsher orders, but tonight they remembered what unity felt like. For us, sitting now in safe rooms, such moments may seem small, but in the Gulag, they were everything. A shared glance, a steady rhythm, a hum of song. These were victories, even when followed by blows. The crest and the shock belonged together, inseparable, teaching the same lesson. Survival was never steady, but it could be shared. Hidden lessons breathe quietly in darkened rooms. There is a special kind of silence in the barracks after the lamps are turned down. It is not the silence of sleep, nor the silence of peace. It is the hush of people lying awake, bones aching, stomachs gnawing, thoughts circling in narrow rooms with no escape. Yet within that silence, sometimes a voice would rise, soft, careful, steady, the voice of a teacher. The Gulag was built to erase the self, to grind individuality into dust under the weight of quotas and commands. But knowledge, like hunger, like memory, could not be erased so easily. Among the prisoners were doctors, engineers, poets, professors, mothers who had taught their children, fathers who had spoken wisdom to their sons. In the camp, their skills no longer mattered officially. Yet when night fell and the guards withdrew, they mattered more than ever. One such figure was Anna, a woman with weary eyes and a steady manner. By day, she swung an axe or hauled timber, her hands blistered and raw. But by night, she became a teacher again. She would sit on her bunk, back straight despite exhaustion, and whisper lessons into the darkness. Sometimes she taught languages, French words, English phrases, Russian poetry that had been censored but lived on in memory. Other nights, she spoke of history, of books burned but not forgotten. Her students were not children, but fellow prisoners, grown men and women starved in body but hungry in mind. Imagine it, a barracks filled with the sound of wind pressing against wooden walls, the faint crackle of a struggling stove, the shuffle of bodies settling into place. Then, low and careful, Anna's voice begins. "Repeat after me," she might whisper, offering a phrase in English. And from the bunks, murmurs rose, broken accents, uncertain tones, but eager. "Good," she would say, nodding in the dim light. And for a moment, the barracks was no longer just a prison. It was a classroom. The lessons were not only about words or dates, they were about survival of the spirit. To learn a new phrase was to imagine a different world, a place where one might use that language freely. To recall a line of poetry was to remind oneself that beauty still existed, even if only in memory. Knowledge became resistance, quiet and unrecorded, but profound. Other teachers emerged as well. A mathematician scratched problems with a splinter of wood on the floorboards, letting others puzzle over the answers. A scientist explained the stars, pointing through cracks in the roof when the night was clear. A mother sang lullabies from her village, teaching the children and adults alike songs they had never heard. Each voice was a seed, planted in frozen soil, waiting for spring. The guards did not always notice, or perhaps they did and looked away. What threat, they may have thought, could words or numbers pose to an empire? But those who listened knew the truth. The greatest threat to despair was memory and imagination. A person who remembered a poem was harder to break than one who knew only hunger. A person who could whisper the names of stars carried a horizon inside them, no matter how high the fences rose. One night, Anna recited Pushkin in a low, musical voice. The words rolled softly, almost like a lullaby. Around her, hardened men with hollow cheeks closed their eyes, letting the rhythm carry them somewhere far beyond the camp. For those few minutes, the Gulag dissolved. They were simply human beings again, listening to poetry. When she finished, no one clapped, no one spoke. But the silence that followed was different, lighter, warmer, filled with something unbroken. Not all voices were welcome, of course. The camp held informants, too, prisoners who traded information for privileges. To speak too freely was dangerous. So the teachers learned caution. Lessons were shared in whispers, passed like contraband. A new phrase here, a line of verse there, repeated under the breath while chopping wood or marching to the site. The knowledge spread like smoke. thin, elusive, impossible to catch. And so the teacher's voice became more than one person's gift. It became a collective act, the sharing of knowledge as a way to remind one another of their humanity. One prisoner taught a comrade to write his name. Another passed on a recipe remembered from home, describing each step with loving detail, as though the listener could taste it. A soldier explained strategy from old campaigns, not because it mattered in the camp, but because it gave shape to memory, order to chaos. In this way, education was smuggled into the heart of suffering. No books, no chalkboards, no desks, only memory, voice, and listening ears. Yet it was enough, more than enough. It was a flame kept alive, fragile but steady, refusing to be extinguished. If you sit quietly tonight, you might hear echoes of such a voice in your own life. Perhaps a teacher long ago who spoke gently to you, a parent who told stories at bedtime, a friend who shared knowledge without expecting anything in return. These voices live on, shaping us long after the moment has passed. In the same way, the teacher's voice in the barracks outlasted hunger, cold, and fear. The prisoners knew rations could be cut, hours extended, punishments inflicted. But a lesson whispered in the night could not be taken back once learned. It was carried within, tucked into memory, ready to be recalled in some brighter future. That was the true defiance, the survival of thought. A steady friend shows how to endure gently. Not every act of survival was grand. Often, it was held in the quiet constancy of a companion, someone who did not falter, did not disappear, who remained at your side when the rules shifted like sand beneath your feet. In the camp, where betrayal was common and fear dissolved trust, the presence of one steady friend could mean the difference between collapse and endurance. He was not always the strongest or the loudest. He did not give speeches or stir defiance with gestures. He simply walked beside you, adjusting his steps so that your rhythm matched his. He carried silence well, spoke when needed, and reminded you, sometimes with nothing more than a glance, that you were not entirely alone. Imagine a frozen dawn. Prisoners line up in the yard, breath rising in small clouds. The air is brittle, stinging the inside of lungs. You sway on your feet, too weak from hunger, too tired from the long night. A guard's shout pierces the air. The march begins. Your knees buckle slightly, but then a shoulder presses against yours. A hand brushes your sleeve, steadying you. It is the friend. He says nothing. He doesn't need to. The message is clear. We walk together. Through long hours of labor, he is there. When you swing the axe too wildly, he murmurs, "Pace yourself." Small strokes. Save your strength when you forget to shield. Your hands, he nudges you. Wrap the rags tighter. These are not lectures, not rebukes. They are reminders, born from experience, offered without judgment. Each one keeps you from wasting energy, from making a mistake that could cost dearly. In the evenings, when the barracks sink into gloom, the steady friend is the one who quietly divides a crust of bread, not boasting of generosity, but placing half in your palm as if it were the most natural act. He is the one who holds back his place near the stove for you, or who takes the draftier bunk without complaint. He does not frame these choices as sacrifice. To him, it is simply what must be done for both to endure. There were few such figures in the camps, and that rarity made them precious. Many prisoners, driven by hunger and fear, looked only to themselves. Some betrayed others for crumbs or privileges. But the steady friend chose another path, not out of naive optimism, but out of a hard-earned knowledge that survival was strongest when shared. He understood what the guards themselves often forgot. Solidarity made prisoners harder to break. Sometimes the friend was not a lifelong companion, not even someone known before the arrest. More often than not, he was a stranger who became familiar only through shared suffering. Bonds formed in frost and labor, unplanned, unasked for, but forged stronger than iron. A man from Kiev might stand beside a woman from Moscow, a soldier beside a schoolteacher. They might never have spoken in another life. Yet here, they leaned on each other, breathed in rhythm, carried burdens together. The steady friend was not immune to despair. He had his own nights of staring at the ceiling, his own doubts about surviving another season. But he hid them well, or at least carried them with a kind of quiet courage. And by doing so, he gave others something to lean upon. Strength shared, even imperfect, spread like warmth through a drafty barracks. One evening, after a long day of cutting timber, you sit on the bunk, shoulders sagging, fingers numb. The steady friend pulls a splinter from your hand, working with gentle precision. "Keep it clean," he mutters, handing you a rag. "Don't let it fester." His tone is gruff, but his care is unmistakable. In that small act, you glimpse a kind of grace, the grace of someone who refuses to let despair erase compassion. These friendships rarely ended in declarations. There were no promises of forever, no speeches of loyalty. Words were dangerous. Bonds were shown, not spoken. A piece of bread, a shared glance, a steady arm in the snow, that was the vocabulary of the steady friend. When others betrayed, the friend remained. When rules shifted, the friend adapted alongside you. When punishments fell, he whispered, "One more day." These simple words, repeated, became a mantra. Not a grand dream of freedom, not a vision of escape, just the promise that tomorrow might come, and with it, another chance. In a place designed to strip people of trust, the steady friend was proof that trust could survive. He did not banish hunger. He did not soften blows. He could not change the rules. But he could walk beside you, shoulder to shoulder, step for step. And that was enough to steady not only your body, but your spirit. If you think back, perhaps you too can remember such a figure in your own life. Not in a camp, not in such extremity, but in times of hardship nonetheless. A friend who sat quietly with you, who reminded you to eat, who lent you strength without calling it sacrifice. These are the companions who leave their mark deepest, not through noise but through constancy. The Gulag swallowed thousands, tens of thousands, yet many survived because one steady friend stood beside them. His name may not appear in records. History may not remember his face. But in the whispered testimonies of survivors, he remains. The one who steadied, the one who stayed. Bread and thread weave kindness through thin days. Bread was more than food. In the camps, it became a unit of time, a measure of hope, and the symbol of every bargain between despair and endurance. Each morning, rations were cut and distributed, weighed with precision, guarded by watchful eyes. A piece of bread was never just a piece. It was tomorrow's labor, a moment of relief, a treasure more valuable than gold. Prisoners carried their rations as carefully as one might cradle an heirloom. Some wrapped their bread in cloth and tucked it inside their coats, close to the skin. Others hid it in shoes, risking dirt for the sake of safety. A few could not resist and ate it all at once, the hunger too sharp to deny. But many learned restraint, nibbling crumbs, stretching bites across the long hours, treating each mouthful like a ceremony. Bread was also a gift, though the giving often seemed impossible. To share half a ration was to shorten one's own life. Yet it happened. A man near death passed his bread to a younger comrade with the words, "You will outlast me." A mother, imprisoned alongside her daughter, gave her entire ration away, surviving instead on watery soup. Such sacrifices lingered in memory, spoken of decades later as proof that even in a system built on cruelty, humanity still flickered. Thread, on the other hand, seemed almost trivial. Who could care about thread when hunger gnawed and cold bit the skin? And yet, thread too became a lifeline. Clothes wore out quickly under relentless labor. Sleeves tore, boots cracked, mittens unraveled. Without repair, exposure to frost was as deadly as starvation, and so the ability to mend, a needle scavenged, a string pulled from old cloth, a patch cut from rags, became a kind of salvation. In every barracks, there was someone who knew how to sew. Perhaps she had once been a seamstress in a village, or he had once patched uniforms in the army. Now, with nothing but scraps, they worked miracles. A coat too thin was thickened with layers of cloth. A boot that split was bound with thread and reinforced with wood shavings. Mittens were stitched from torn shirts, their seams rough but serviceable. Each repair stretched survival further, turning rags into armor against the cold. Imagine a dim barracks, the stove barely glowing, shadows long across the walls. A prisoner sits hunched, needle flashing faintly in the lamplight. Around him, others watch with quiet hope. When he finishes, he presses the mended glove back into its owner's hands. "Try it now," he whispers. The fabric is uneven, the stitches clumsy, but the glove is whole again. The prisoner flexes his fingers, feeling warmth return. He nods in thanks. A fragment of dignity has been restored. Bread and thread were not only about survival, they were also about meaning. To repair a garment was to say, "Your life is worth mending." To share bread was to declare, "Your life is worth feeding." In both acts, kindness was woven into the fabric of daily struggle. These small exchanges pushed back against the system's goal of reducing people to numbers. They reminded prisoners that they were still individuals, still worthy of care. Some prisoners even combined the two. With bits of thread, they stitched tiny pouches inside their coats, places to hide crumbs of bread from thieves. Others wove rags into belts where bread could be tucked securely during marches. The ingenuity was endless, born not of abundance but of desperation. Yet in every stitch was a form of quiet defiance, a refusal to surrender to ruin. The guards rarely noticed, or if they did, they dismissed it. What harm could come from sewing mittens or breaking bread? To them, such acts seemed insignificant, but for the prisoners, they were everything. Bread kept the body alive, thread kept the body warm. Together, they kept the soul intact. There is a story of a man who unraveled his own blanket, pulling it into strands to make thread. He used it to mend boots for others in his barracks, though it meant he slept colder. Years later, survivors still remembered him, not because of his strength, but because of his generosity, woven literally into the fabric of their lives. Think of it this way: in a place built to destroy, every crumb shared, every stitch sewn, was a declaration that life was still valuable. Bread and thread, ordinary things, became extraordinary because of the context. They were not luxuries, but they carried the weight of love. For us tonight, it may be difficult to imagine. We live in rooms where bread is abundant, where sewing is often a hobby rather than a necessity. Yet the principle remains. Kindness is measured not only in grand gestures, but in the smallest ones. A sandwich shared, a button sewn, a blanket offered. These are the acts that knit community together in any age. In the Gulag, prisoners remembered them as the real miracles, not freedom, not rescue, not sudden salvation, but bread and thread, passed quietly from hand to hand. Night, songs returned softly, where silence had reigned. At night, when the barracks sank into a chill deeper than the snow outside, when words became too heavy to risk, music sometimes found its way back. Not the music of orchestras or concert halls, not even the simple strumming of a guitar. Those things were absent here. It was the music of breath, of voice, of memory carried gently through the dark. No one announced it. There were no gatherings, no plans. The song would begin like a secret, one voice rising low from a corner bunk. At first, it might sound no louder than a whisper, almost mistaken for a sigh. Then, slowly, it would take shape. A melody known from childhood, a folk tune remembered from villages far away, a hymn half forgotten but still alive in the heart. Around the room, heads would lift slightly. Eyes, hollow from hunger, softened. The hum of breath joined in, hesitant at first, then steadier. Soon the barracks was filled with something new. Not silence, not despair, but song. Imagine it. Dozens of voices, cracked and weary, blending in imperfect harmony. A lullaby sung by a grandmother in a Ukrainian village. A Russian folk tune about rivers and wide fields. A Yiddish song carried from a vanished shtetl. All layered together, overlapping, weaving through the cold. The sound was rough, uneven, yet profoundly human. For a few minutes, the Gulag became something else. Not freedom, but not complete captivity either. The guards sometimes tolerated it, sometimes did not. A harsh voice might cut through the night, silencing the singers. But more often the guards ignored it. Perhaps they heard only noise, not music. Perhaps they remembered their own villages, their own mothers' songs, and chose to let it pass. Whatever the reason, the songs continued, fragile but persistent. Music carried risks, of course. To sing too loudly was to draw punishment. To choose the wrong lyrics could be called defiance. Yet still, voices rose. Why? Because song filled a space that silence could not. Where words failed, music carried what hearts could not speak. Hunger, grief, longing. These became bearable when sung together. In one barracks, there was a man once known as a tenor in a provincial theater. His voice had grown thin from hunger, yet it still carried a trace of beauty. When he sang, even softly, the others listened in stillness. His songs were not grand arias, but simple tunes, snatches of lullabies, old romances, even playful children's rhymes. Each carried memory like perfume, a reminder of lives once lived beyond fences and frost. Others brought their own melodies. A woman who had worked in a textile mill hummed work songs from the factory floor. A soldier remembered marching songs from the front. A child imprisoned with his mother recited the notes of a prayer. Together they formed a patchwork of sound, stitched from many places and times, but united in the present moment. The effect was more than comfort. Song became defiance, subtle and undeniable. It reminded prisoners that they still had voices, that their breath could shape beauty, even in ugliness. The system could strip them of food, clothing, freedom, but not of sound. And so, softly, they reclaimed a fragment of themselves. Sometimes the songs became rituals. On nights of particular hardship, after a beating, after a death, the singing rose stronger. It was not to celebrate, but to hold grief together. A dirge hummed by one man became a chorus of mourning. Tears fell, hidden in the dark. Yet the sound transformed sorrow into something shared, something survivable. Other nights, the songs leaned toward hope. Prisoners whispered of flowers, of fields, of rivers. They sang of seasons that would return, of warmth yet to come. These were not promises. They were memories turned forward, reminders that winter was not forever, nor was suffering eternal. The smallest songs were sometimes the most powerful. A lullaby sung to a child echoed across bunks, carrying peace to dozens who had no children of their own. A whistle of a shepherd's tune stirred memories of green hillsides in men who had not seen grass in years. Even the rhythm of tapping, a spoon against a bowl, a hand against wood, became music when repeated with care. And so, the nights were marked not only by cold, but by melody. Fragile, fleeting, but unforgettable. Survivors later spoke of these songs as lifelines. "We sang ourselves alive," one said. "The guards had power, but the songs were ours." Think of it. In the dark, half-frozen, half-starved, dozens of people lying on wooden bunks, their breath shaping notes that rose together. The harmony was not perfect. It was broken, uneven, sometimes little more than a hum, but it was enough to remind them that they were still human, still capable of beauty. For us, sitting safely tonight, perhaps with music playing softly in another room, it may seem small, but in the Gulag, these songs at night were everything. They stitched together the tatters of spirit. They offered what no ration of bread could give, the nourishment of hope. Labor becomes a measured survival dance. Work in the camps was not only a burden, it was a battlefield where survival played out silently, not with weapons, not with overt defiance, but with rhythm, slow, deliberate, hidden within the endless hours of labor. To outsiders, the work might have looked mechanical, men swinging axes, women hauling logs, prisoners shoveling snow or laying rails. But inside those motions lived a secret choreography, a dance of survival measured in breaths and heartbeats. At dawn, the prisoners marched out, their figures bent beneath frost and fatigue. The guards barked orders, demanding speed, demanding quotas that no human body could sustain. To obey literally was to collapse, perhaps even to die. To refuse was suicide. And so, the prisoners invented a third way, the rhythm of pacing, the art of appearing to obey while quietly preserving strength. It began with breath. Experienced prisoners taught newcomers how to inhale with the swing of the axe, exhale with the drop, never wasting air, never rushing. "Slow strokes," they whispered. "Save your lungs." The untrained, eager to prove themselves, swung wildly, collapsing after an hour. The veterans, moving with steady repetition, lasted the day. Their rhythm seemed lazy to an untrained eye, but it was the wisdom of endurance. Feet learned a similar pattern. On marches, one did not stride boldly, nor lag behind. One walked just fast enough to keep step, conserving energy, letting the stronger shoulders ahead break the wind. In deep snow, prisoners followed footprints precisely, each step inside another's mark, saving strength otherwise wasted. It was a rhythm of shadows, invisible to guards, but vital to survival. Hands, too, found patterns. A shovel lifted with jerks tore muscles. A shovel raised smoothly, with practiced grace, could be repeated thousands of times. Prisoners spoke little, but they watched one another, copying motions that looked effortless. The smallest adjustments, how to grip a handle, how to bend knees, were not trivial. They were lessons written in bruises and frostbite, passed quietly, one body teaching another. The work rhythm was not merely physical, it was communal. Entire brigades learned to move as one, slowing together when guards looked away, speeding up when eyes returned. They shielded each other, arranging lines so the weakest were hidden in the middle. protected by stronger figures at the edges. Loads were shifted subtly. A heavier log balanced across several shoulders rather than crushing one. It was not rebellion, but it was resistance, the kind that could not be punished because it looked like obedience. In the long afternoons, as the sun slid low but never seemed to set, the rhythm became almost hypnotic. Axe, breath, drop, shovel, lift, turn, step, step, step. It dulled hunger, masked pain, numbed thought. To fall into rhythm was to survive the hour, then the day, then the week. One prisoner described it later as becoming a machine on purpose, so the soul could rest while the body worked. And yet, within this rhythm, sparks of humanity flickered. Someone hummed a tune, matching strokes to melody. Another muttered numbers, turning each swing into a count, as if reciting equations in secret. A woman whispered verses between breaths, the cadence of poetry aligning with the cadence of labor. The rhythm was survival, but it was also identity, smuggled inside repetition. The guards sensed it sometimes. They shouted louder, struck more often, trying to break the rhythm, but they could not watch every motion, every step. The prisoners had numbers on their side, and the rhythm flowed through hundreds of bodies, slipping away whenever a whip cracked, returning as soon as the guard's back was turned. It was a fragile equilibrium, dangerous and essential. Too much slowing, and punishment fell. Too much effort and exhaustion killed. The steady rhythm in between was the narrow path, walked daily, learned instinctively. At night, when bodies collapsed on bunks, conversations often returned to the day's work. "Swing lower," someone advised. "Save your shoulders." "Bend here," another demonstrated, tracing the air with a tired hand. These were not idle exchanges. They were survival manuals, spoken in fragments, revised each evening. The next day, the lessons showed in movements that looked smoother, quieter, more efficient. One might think such rhythm stripped life of meaning, reduced people to cogs. But for prisoners, it did the opposite. It gave them agency in a world where choices were scarce. To choose one's rhythm, to decide when to breathe, when to slow, when to quicken, that was to carve out space for selfhood. The rhythm belonged to them, not to the guards. There is something deeply human in rhythm. Our ancestors sang while harvesting, rowed boats in time, marched in cadence. Rhythm unites, steadies, sustains. In the camps, it was rediscovered not as art, but as necessity. Yet even necessity carried beauty. A line of prisoners swinging axes together, snow rising like powder with each blow, became a kind of dark ballet. Harsh, yes, but also strangely graceful, a testimony to resilience. For those who survived, the memory of that rhythm never left. Decades later, they recalled the sound of synchronized labor, the crunch of boots, the crack of wood, the sigh of shovels. These sounds haunted them, but they also reminded them of survival. "We made music of labor," one man said, because music was the only way to survive labor. If you close your eyes tonight, perhaps you can imagine it, a frozen forest, hundreds of figures moving in slow unison, their breaths clouding in the air, their motions deliberate, their survival bound to rhythm. From afar, it looks like endless toil, but within, it is strategy, unity, and the stubborn refusal to collapse. A sudden blow hushes the air around. Life in the camps was lived on thin ice. For weeks, even months, prisoners might manage to find an uneasy balance. Work paced in rhythms, bread stretched carefully, small kindnesses exchanged quietly. And then, without warning, the surface would shatter. The blow came swiftly, often without cause, a reminder that no rhythm was truly safe. It could happen in the workyard. A man swung his axe a fraction too slowly, and the guard's boot met his ribs. He doubled over, breathless, yet forced himself upright again. Around him, the other prisoners kept working, eyes averted, their own axes rising and falling as if nothing had happened. To stop, to look, was dangerous. And so the forest echoed with the steady rhythm of labor, punctuated by the cough of a man swallowing pain. Or the blow might come in the barracks. A guard entered suddenly, eyes sharp, scanning bunks. He picked a prisoner at random, a woman too thin to rise quickly. Enough, and dragged her forward. She had done nothing visible, nothing to provoke. Yet the slap fell, the shove followed. The humiliation was complete. Silence thickened in the room. The woman stumbled back to her bunk, face burning, ribs aching. No words were spoken. The lesson was clear. Safety was illusion. Sometimes the blow was not physical, but news. A letter arriving from Moscow, sealed and official, informing a prisoner that his family had been arrested, scattered to other camps. He had been a trustee, an informant, someone who believed cooperation earned protection. But the letter proved otherwise. The silence that followed his tears was heavier than any bruise. If even loyalty could not shield one's family, then what could? The sudden blow shattered more than bone or breath. It shattered trust. It reminded prisoners that the ground beneath them was never solid. The system thrived on unpredictability. Fear was sharper when it came without pattern. One day passed in fragile calm, the next in sudden terror. This kept everyone alert, exhausted, unable to build hope. And yet, paradoxically, the sudden blow also awakened something else: solidarity. In the moments after, when guards turned away, prisoners looked at one another differently. A hand passed bread to the man who had been kicked. A rag was dipped in water to cool the woman's swollen face. Quiet words, "You will heal. One more day," were whispered when the guards could not hear. The blow that was meant to isolate often drew people closer. One winter night, such a blow struck your own barracks. The day had ended in relative calm. The brigade had worked steadily. Rations, thin as ever, had been distributed without incident. In the dark, people settled into bunks, whispering small comforts. Then the door slammed open. A guard strode in, shouting a name. The prisoner he chose, a young man, barely more than a boy, stood trembling. He had no idea what he had done. The guard pulled him outside. Minutes passed, then a thud echoed faintly through the snow. When the boy was dragged back, blood streaked his cheek, his eyes wide with shock. He collapsed onto his bunk, unable to speak. The barracks fell into utter stillness. Even those who had endured worse felt the tremor. No one knew why he had been singled out. No one ever would. That night, silence pressed so heavy it seemed to muffle even breath. Yet in the morning, when the march began, the boy found himself steadied by shoulders on either side. Two men bore part of his weight, disguising their help as accident. The guards saw only the line moving forward. But within that quiet support lay defiance. The blow had not broken them. The sudden blow also reshaped memory. Survivors later recalled not only the pain, but the hush that followed. The air seemed to thicken, the world to pause. In those moments, everything sharpened. The crack of a whip, the gasp of breath, the quick glance of sympathy. Details seared into memory, with clarity sharper than hunger itself. The cruelty was deliberate. To strike at random was to remind everyone that fairness did not exist here. Punishment was not tied to guilt, because guilt was irrelevant. Punishment was a tool, wielded unpredictably, to keep fear alive. A world without rules was harder to navigate than one with strict ones. The sudden blow made sure of that. And yet, for all its power, the blow never achieved what the system intended. It bruised flesh, broke bones, stole sleep. But it also deepened the quiet currents of solidarity. Each blow, each shock, reminded prisoners of their common fate. They learned to shield one another, to pass strength hand to hand. In this way, cruelty fed the very resilience it tried to extinguish. Think of it now, as you sit in calm surroundings. The sudden noises of your night, the slam of a door, the shout from a neighbor, the bark of a dog. These are only interruptions. But in the camp, such interruptions were life-changing. Each sound could signal danger. Each pause could signal a blow. And yet, people endured. It is tempting to imagine that endurance meant numbness, but numbness was not enough. Endurance meant feeling the blow, absorbing the shock, and then continuing anyway, step after step, day after day. That was the quiet defiance hidden in every march, every swing of the axe, every whispered song at night. One candle's glow steadies many in the dark. Solidarity in the camps did not roar. It did not announce itself with banners or slogans. It glowed instead, like a candle in the drafty dark, small, flickering, yet impossible to extinguish. It spread quietly from one person to another, casting light not through words, but through actions. A shared burden, a hidden crumb, a whispered lesson. Imagine a barracks on a winter night. The stove burns weakly, its coals fading. The wind presses against the walls, slipping through cracks. Dozens lie in silence, wrapped in rags, shivering in their bunks. Then, someone lights a stub of candle, no longer than a finger, scavenged and saved for weeks. The flame wavers uncertainly, but it holds. Heads turn toward it. The room, still cold, feels warmer simply because the darkness is no longer complete. That is solidarity. One small light easing the suffering of many. In the Gulag, survival demanded selfishness, or so the system intended. Rations were too small, hours too long, punishments too frequent. Every rule was designed to pit prisoner against prisoner, criminal against political, man against woman, Russian against Ukrainian. Divide and control was easy. Yet again and again, prisoners discovered the opposite truth. Division weakened, solidarity strengthened. The candle of solidarity took many forms. Sometimes it was physical, stronger prisoners shielding weaker ones from a guard's eye, or carrying logs together so no single back was broken. Other times, it was emotional, one person whispering encouragement, reminding another to pace, themselves, to save strength, to endure one more day. These acts, unremarkable on their own, became powerful in accumulation. There was risk, always. To share food meant losing energy oneself. To intervene during a beating meant drawing punishment. Even to speak kindly could attract suspicion. Yet prisoners chose solidarity anyway, not always consciously, but instinctively. They knew that isolation was death. Together, they could bend the system's cruelty, if only slightly. One day, in the timberline, a prisoner collapsed in the snow. His face was pale, lips blue, body refusing to rise. The guards shouted, raising rifles. But before blows could fall, others stepped forward. They bent, lifted him between their shoulders, and carried him as if still working. To the guards, the pace continued. To the prisoners, solidarity had preserved a life. The candle glowed brighter. At night, solidarity showed itself in whispers of knowledge. A veteran taught a newcomer how to wrap feet properly, using rags in layers, never letting fabric grow wet. Another explained which weeds could be eaten safely in spring, which roots would kill. These teachings were not grand, but they traveled quickly, prisoner to prisoner, like flame passing from wick to wick, and with each lesson, survival lengthened. Solidarity was not always harmonious. Arguments still flared, food was stolen, tempers snapped. Fear made people cruel at times. But beneath the surface, the candle burned. Even the angriest quarrel often ended in quiet sharing because everyone understood. Tomorrow's labor would demand more than one body alone could give. Perhaps the most striking form of solidarity was silence. When a guard demanded names, who sang, who slowed, who whispered, prisoners looked at the floor, their lips sealed. The silence risked punishment, but it protected the group. Each refusal to betray was another layer of wax around the fragile flame. Survivors later spoke of how solidarity changed the texture of time. A day endured alone felt endless, crushing. A day endured with others, even in silence, passed more bearably. A shared glance, a shoulder pressed in snow, a hand steadying another on the march, these things shortened the distance to evening. Solidarity did not erase suffering, but it divided the weight across many shoulders. Think of your own life in moments of hardship. A friend who sat with you in a hospital waiting room. A neighbor who brought food after loss. A stranger who offered directions in a storm. These are small candles, and you remember them still. In the Gulag, such candles meant survival itself. There is a story of one winter when rations were cut even further. Hunger grew unbearable. A group of prisoners pooled their bread, crumbling it into a pot of hot water to make a thin porridge. Each received only a sip, but the act mattered more than the nourishment. To eat together, even in scarcity, was to resist the system's intent. The porridge was a candle's glow, warming more hearts than bodies. The guards never understood fully. They believed control came from fear, and in part they were right. But they underestimated the stubborn resilience born of solidarity. A single candle cannot fight the dark of a long night. Yet dozens of candles, lit one after another, can hold back the shadows long enough for dawn. For the prisoners, that was enough. To last until morning, to last until spring, to last one more day. Each act of solidarity was a promise. You are not alone, and neither am I. Winter's bite sinks deepest when hope runs thin. Winter in the camps did not simply arrive. It descended, like a beast closing its jaws. The first flakes of snow in October seemed harmless, almost beautiful. They dusted the roofs of barracks, softened the harsh lines of fences, muffled the clang of iron. But soon, beauty gave way to cruelty. The air thickened with frost, the ground hardened like stone, and the cold began to bite. It was not a gentle chill, but a set of teeth, gnawing, relentless, sinking deeper with each passing week. Prisoners knew what was coming long before the worst days arrived. Veterans spoke of January and February in hushed tones. The teeth, they said, wait until then. Everyone prepared as best they could. Rags were stuffed into boots, sleeves were bound with twine, straw was layered inside shirts for insulation. Small caches of food were hidden away, scraps guarded like treasure. Yet no preparation was ever enough. Winter always bit harder than memory promised. The mornings began with dread. At roll call, prisoners stamped their feet against frozen earth, trying to keep blood moving. Breath rose in clouds that froze on eyelashes and brows, stiffening faces into masks. When the march began, boots crunched through snow that reached the knees, then the waist. To stumble was to risk being left behind, swallowed by the cold. Work in the forest or on the railway became a different kind of torture. Tools stuck to bare skin, tearing flesh if gripped carelessly. Metal cracked in the deep frost, shovels splintered, axes dulled against wood hardened by ice, hands numbed quickly, and once numb, they no longer obeyed. A man might think he still held his tool, only to realize it had fallen from fingers stiff as iron. And when hands failed, punishment followed. Food, never enough, became even more inadequate. Hunger grew sharper in the cold, demanding more fuel than the thin rations could supply. Bodies shrank, ribs protruded, eyes hollowed. The hungrier a prisoner grew, the colder he felt. The colder he felt, the more his body demanded food. It was a circle with no exit, a spiral downward. Winter's teeth gnawed on both sides at once. Hunger and cold, cold and hunger, alternating bites until strength gave way. Each day, more prisoners failed. Some collapsed in snowdrifts, unable to rise. Others slipped away quietly at night, their bodies stiff by morning roll call. The dead could not be buried. The ground was frozen solid. They were stacked outside, rigid as logs, waiting for spring. The sight became a grim monument, a reminder of how sharp the season's bite could be. And yet, even here, life persisted. Veterans taught small tricks. Keep moving, even when resting. Flex fingers inside mittens, shift weight from foot to foot. Stillness is death, they warned. They showed how to huddle in bunks, sharing warmth like animals. They explained that despair was as deadly as frostbite. Find a reason, one whispered. Any reason to get up tomorrow. Night was the hardest. Inside the barracks, the stove barely glowed. Prisoners huddled close, layers of breath turning into fog that crystallized on walls. Windows cracked with frost, letting drafts creep in. Sleep was restless, interrupted by shivers. Yet within the misery, sparks of humanity survived. Someone adjusted another's blanket. Someone gave their warmer spot to a weaker comrade. In such gestures, the teeth of winter lost some of their bite. There were nights when voices rose against the cold, stories told in whispers, memories of summers past, descriptions of warmth so vivid they made the barracks glow in imagination. One man spoke of stone steps heated by the sun, another of bread warm from the oven. Soon, the room filled with recollections of warmth, each prisoner adding a fragment. Together, they built a fire no guard could extinguish. The cold still bit, but their spirits glowed. Still, winter claimed many. Survivors remembered February as the cruelest month. Not the coldest, that was January, but the most despairing. By then, bodies were too exhausted, hopes too thin, memories too faint. February broke the spirit, veterans said, more than it broke the body. It was the month when even the strongest sometimes surrendered. But those who endured carried scars and wisdom. They spoke later of the way winter stripped life to its core. You learn what matters, one said. Warmth, food, companionship. All else is noise. Winter's teeth were merciless, but they revealed truths hidden in easier times. That humanity, even bitten and bloodied, could still hold warmth. That survival was not only possible, but meaningful when carried together. For us tonight, sitting in rooms warmed by stoves or central heat, it is difficult to imagine such a season. Yet if you listen closely, perhaps you can feel a faint echo. The sting of cold air when you open a door in January, the hunger that sharpens after a long day, the relief of a blanket pulled tight. These small echoes remind us how precious warmth is and how deeply solidarity matters when the world grows cold. Hunger lingers like a shadow, constant and cold. Hunger was not simply an emptiness in the stomach. In the camps, it became a presence, a shadow that followed each prisoner from dawn to dusk and into the restless hours of night. It whispered in the ear, clawed at the ribs, blurred the eyes, and bent the mind toward one thought only: food. And yet, in that endless gnawing, people still found ways to endure, to remember, and sometimes even to share. At breakfast, if it could be called that, rations were handed out with precision. A piece of bread weighed to the gram, a ladle of watery soup where cabbage leaves floated like ghosts. The portion was gone in seconds, swallowed by mouths too empty to savor. But the hunger remained. It lingered all day, a dull ache sharpening with each hour. By evening, the ache had grown claws. Prisoners spoke often of hunger, but rarely to complain. Complaining solved nothing. Instead, they spoke in memories. The crust of bread from a mother's kitchen, the smell of onions frying in butter, the taste of apples in autumn. Men recited recipes aloud as though reading from invisible cookbooks. Women described holiday feasts, listing each dish in careful order. Even children, too young to have cooked, remembered sweets with aching precision. These spoken meals became a way to quiet hunger's shadow, if only for moments. Some prisoners developed rituals to manage the gnawing. One broke his bread into 12 equal pieces, eating one each hour, stretching the ration across the day. Another chewed each bite for minutes, rolling the taste around his tongue until nothing remained. A woman saved her bread until night, so she could fall asleep with the memory of eating. These small strategies did not defeat hunger, but they made its shadow more bearable. Hunger changed the body first. Cheeks hollowed, eyes sank, ribs protruded. Skin lost color, hands trembled. The body consumed itself slowly, burning fat, then muscle, until only the barest strength remained. But hunger also changed the mind. Thoughts narrowed, circling endlessly around food. A man might dream of bread and wake with tears. A woman might smell soup in her sleep, only to taste nothing in the morning. Hunger blurred the line between reality and imagination, and hunger tested morality. In the shadow's grip, people sometimes stole from one another. Bread hidden under a pillow might vanish by dawn. A pot of thin porridge might be scraped clean before its owner returned. The betrayal cut deeper than the loss itself. Yet even then, acts of generosity persisted. A sick man, too weak to eat, pressed his bread into a friend's hand. A mother, gaunt and fading, fed her child her entire ration. Hunger's shadow revealed cruelty, but also sacrifice. One winter evening, a prisoner named Dmitri stumbled into the barracks, clutching his stomach. He had eaten something from a shed, believing it was grain. It was poison. He writhed in pain, vomiting blood. Isaac, the camp doctor, did what he could, but supplies were non-existent. Dmitri died before dawn. Hunger had twisted his judgment, driven him to mistake death for nourishment. The barracks fell silent. No one blamed him. They all understood. Hunger had no mercy. Yet even in its cruelty, hunger carried strange moments of unity. Prisoners sometimes gathered at night to share memories of meals, each voice adding to the banquet of recollection. A man described borscht so vividly that others swore they smelled beets and dill. A woman told of Easter cakes dusted with sugar, their tops golden from the oven. Laughter flickered in the dark as stories grew. The shadow still clung, but together they held it at bay. Hunger was also teacher. It taught patience, to wait for the next crumb, the next ladle, without complaint. It taught discipline, to measure bites, to hide food safely, to resist the urge to devour. And it taught empathy, strangely enough. Those who suffered most understood one another most deeply. A glance at hollow cheeks was enough to know. I see your shadow too. In spring, When snow melted and the forest stirred, hunger's shadow changed shape. Wild greens appeared, pine needles to chew, birch sap to drink. Prisoners risked punishment to forage, learning from veterans which plants were safe. These meager finds brought relief, not enough to erase hunger, but enough to dull its claws. Yet hunger never disappeared entirely. It was always there, waiting, lurking, reminding everyone that food was both life and power. Decades later, survivors still spoke of hunger as if it had been a living creature. "It sat with me," one said. "It lay down beside me at night." Another recalled how he dreamed of bread long after liberation, waking with his mouth full of air. The shadow remained even in freedom, a reminder of its long dominion. And yet, alongside the pain, there were memories of defiance, of bread broken and shared, of soup ladled equally, even when there was not enough, of laughter born from imagined feasts. Hunger's shadow was vast, but it never covered the candlelight of solidarity. For us, sitting tonight with food within reach, hunger may seem distant, yet we know its echo in smaller ways. The emptiness of a skipped meal, the longing for comfort food, the relief of warmth in the belly. These faint echoes remind us of how deep the shadow can fall, and how powerful the human will is to endure beneath it. Quiet defiance moves beneath the surface of toil. Rebellion in the camps was rarely loud. There were no uprisings with banners waving, no heroic charges against fences and guns. The system was too vast, the guards too armed, the punishments too final. And yet, beneath the surface of endless labor, there lived a fragile rebellion, so quiet it often went unnoticed by those in power, but so steady it allowed prisoners to endure. It began with something deceptively simple, the slowing of pace. Quotas from Moscow demanded more logs cut, more rails laid, more snow cleared than human strength could provide. To meet them fully was impossible. To refuse outright was death. So the prisoners found a middle ground. They paced themselves deliberately, appearing to work, but never giving all they had. When the guard's eyes turned away, the axe fell more slowly. When boots stomped past, the shovel rested a heartbeat longer. It was not laziness. It was survival disguised as compliance. This rebellion had no leaders, no speeches. It spread like a rhythm, unspoken but understood. Veterans modeled it. Newcomers learned quickly. A brigade might swing in unison, each motion timed so the group appeared busy while conserving precious energy. If one faltered, others shielded him with their bodies, hiding weakness from view. From the outside, the work continued. Inside, the rebellion pulsed like a second heartbeat. The guards noticed, of course. They were not blind. Sometimes they struck harder, shouting louder, lashing out at random prisoners. But they could not watch every swing, every breath. They could not punish everyone without halting production entirely. The system needed bodies as much as fear. And so the fragile rebellion survived, adapting, retreating when blows fell, returning when eyes turned. There were other forms, equally subtle. Tools deliberately dulled, requiring more strokes for less progress. Logs placed awkwardly, slowing the line. Snow shoveled aside only to drift back in minutes. Each act was small, deniable, almost invisible. But together, they slowed the machine, granting prisoners something vital: endurance. Even silence became rebellion. Guards wanted informants, tongues quick to accuse. But prisoners often chose otherwise. When asked who sang in the barracks, who whispered poems, who slowed at work, lips pressed shut. The silence was dangerous, punishable, yet it spread like a shield. To keep quiet was to protect not only oneself, but the group. In that refusal, solidarity took shape. Sometimes rebellion appeared in creativity. A scrap of wood carved into a figure, a song hummed during labor, a poem recited under breath. None of these acts slowed production or defied guards directly. But they declared, "I am still human. I am not only a tool." This was rebellion of the spirit, fragile yet unbreakable, glowing faintly in a world built to extinguish light. The fragility of such defiance was real. One careless word, one mistimed pause, could draw punishment. The rebellion lived on the edge of exposure. That was its danger and its strength. Because it required constant awareness, constant unity, it bound prisoners together more tightly than rules ever could. Each person's small act mattered. Each person's restraint protected the whole. One winter afternoon, as snow fell heavy, a brigade slowed almost imperceptibly. Their shovels moved in steady rhythm, not frantic, but deliberate. The guards shouted, struck a few, but the pace did not change. By evening, the brigade had cleared less than ordered, but still enough to appear compliant. They returned to the barracks battered but intact, with strength saved for another day. That night, no one spoke of rebellion, yet everyone felt it, like warmth spreading quietly through the room. Survivors later recalled these small acts with surprising reverence. They did not speak of escapes, rare and often doomed, or of revolts crushed in blood. They spoke of how they learned to breathe together, to walk together, to carry the illusion of obedience while quietly preserving themselves. "We outlasted them," one said. Not by fighting, by refusing to give everything. The fragile rebellion was not victory in any conventional sense. It did not topple towers or end the system, but it allowed people to live one more day, to protect their inner selves from total surrender. And in a world built on breaking, that was a form of triumph. Think of it now, in the quiet of your evening. You may never need to rebel against such cruelty. Yet you know the feeling of small resistances, the decision to rest when life demands too much, the choice to keep a memory alive when the world forgets, the act of helping another when convenience suggests otherwise. These too are fragile rebellions, and they matter. Memories of warmth kindle fires the body cannot. In the coldest nights of the camp, when even the stove lay empty and the barracks seemed carved from ice, warmth returned not from wood or coal, but from memory. The human mind, desperate and ingenious, reached back to summers past, kitchens long gone, embraces once felt. These recollections were fragile flames, flickering in the dark, but they glowed with a heat no guard could seize. It often began with one voice, perhaps an actor, his body now thin and bent, but his voice still carrying traces of stage. Or a grandmotherly figure, her hair turned gray too soon, whispering like she once did to children. They would speak softly, almost absent-mindedly. I remember the sun on the stone steps of my village, the way it soaked into my back. The barracks would shift. Eyes opened, heads turned, and others joined in. Soon the room filled with fragments of warmth. Someone spoke of a hearth where bread baked until crust turned golden. Another recalled steam rising from a bowl of soup. A soldier remembered the heat of a bathhouse in winter, the rush of air as he stepped out, skin flushed. A mother whispered of holding her child close, feeling the small body radiate against her chest. Each memory was offered like a coal, glowing faintly. Together they built a fire large enough to share. The effect was profound. For an hour the cold seemed less sharp, shivers eased, faces softened. The prisoners lay still, eyes closed, letting the warmth of imagination spread through them. No one pretended it was real. They knew the stove remained weak, The wind still pierced through cracks, but for those moments, the body believed in the heat of memory, and the spirit rested. Warmth did not need to be grand to endure. Survivors remembered the smallest sensations: sunlight through a window, a shawl fresh from drying lines, the press of another's hand. These details were sharper in memory than in the moment they first lived them. Hunger sharpened taste. Cold sharpened the recall of warmth. The worse the present became, the brighter those memories glowed. Of course, memory carried danger too. To dwell too long on warmth could deepen despair, making the absence unbearable. A man who described feasts too vividly sometimes wept afterward. The hunger sharpened beyond bearing. A woman who remembered her child's embrace sometimes grew silent for days. Memory was a fire. It could warm, but it could also burn. And so, prisoners learned balance. They shared enough to comfort, but not enough to consume. The guards could not stop this ritual. To punish a man for speaking of sunshine or bread would have seemed absurd, even to them. And so, memory remained untouchable. The system controlled bodies, rations, hours. But it could not erase what people carried inside: the heat of summers, the taste of food, the glow of human closeness. One particularly brutal night, when the temperature dropped to 60 below, the barracks fell into such a memory chorus. The walls cracked as frost expanded the wood. Breath froze on blankets, yet voices rose, weaving stories of warmth. The actor spoke of theaters lit with chandeliers. The soldier described campfires after battles, flames snapping against night. The mother recalled lullabies sung by the stove, rocking her child. Each memory layered over the last until the cold itself seemed pushed to the corners. Even those who had little to say listened. Their silence was part of the warmth, receiving what others offered. And in that shared remembering, the camp changed. It did not soften, but it loosened its hold for a while. Cruelty could not penetrate the fire built from memory. Years later, survivors still recalled that night of warmth. Not the details of suffering, they had endured so many, but the glow of voices sharing what was lost. "We kept ourselves alive with memory," one said. "It was our stove, our blanket, our bread." The truth of it endured long after the cold. For us, sitting tonight in heated rooms, memory may seem secondary, a pleasant indulgence. But in the Gulag, it was survival. And perhaps even now, in quieter struggles, we know something of it. A photograph recalled, a song remembered, the smell of a loved one's cooking. These warm us in ways no fire can. So, if you close your eyes, perhaps you too can feel it. The sunlight of a childhood afternoon, the embrace of someone long gone, the heat of bread broken fresh from an oven. These things do not fade. They wait, like coals under ash, ready to glow when we need them most. Names remembered carry tomorrow into gentle night. Names were fragile in the camps. They were stripped away at the gate, replaced by numbers shouted at roll call, carved into rosters, scribbled into reports. A man became a unit, a woman became a quota, a child became a statistic. To the system, individuality was waste. Numbers were efficient. Yet within the barracks, within whispers after lights out, names persisted. They were remembered, spoken softly, carried like hidden treasures. There was power in saying a name. To speak it was to declare, "You still exist. You are more than labor. You are more than hunger. You are more than punishment." Even when the body faltered, even when breath grew thin, a name kept a person anchored in the world. It was memory made audible. Prisoners learned quickly who could be trusted to speak names aloud. Sometimes the circle was small, two friends whispering to each other, reminding themselves of their children's names, their parents, their villages. Other times, it was a gathering, hushed but collective, where each prisoner offered one name into the dark. A chain of memory formed, fragile, invisible, yet stronger than the fences outside. The youngest prisoners clung to names most fiercely. A boy barely in his teens repeated his mother's name each night like a prayer. A girl whispered the name of her school teacher, refusing to let that figure vanish. Adults, too, returned to names, of sons, of sisters, of neighbors who had disappeared into the machine. Each name was a spark, a tether back to a life erased by official decrees. Sometimes the names were of the dead. A man would murmur, "My brother Ivan," though Ivan had been shot months earlier. Another would recall a wife who had perished on the transport train. To speak these names was painful, but it was also resistance. Death silenced bodies, but memory kept them present. As long as the names lived in whispers, the dead were not entirely gone. The guards knew the danger of names. That was why they preferred numbers, why they barked them at roll call, why they punished those who lingered on personal identity. Numbers reduced people to tasks: 20 workers to cut timber, 30 to haul rails, 50 to clear snow. But in the barracks, the prisoners quietly reversed the arithmetic. They remembered, they recited, they called each other by given names, even when forbidden. In doing so, they reasserted humanity. One evening, after a brutal day, a woman named Anna gathered a few close companions. She asked each to share the name of someone they had loved. The barracks grew still. One by one, the names came: Sergei, Miriam, Pavel, Oksana. Some were spoken firmly, others through tears. No stories were needed. The names alone carried entire lives. For a moment, the barracks became a chapel of remembrance, filled with invisible presences. It was not only people's names. Places, too, were remembered as if they were living companions. A man whispered the name of his village. A woman the name of her street. Another the name of the river where he had fished as a boy. To recall these names was to rebuild lost worlds, to assure themselves that home was more than a dream. The practice spread quietly. In some brigades, the last words before sleep were not prayers, but names. In others, prisoners scratched names onto wood, onto walls, onto scraps of cloth, leaving traces that guards sometimes destroyed, but never completely erased. Names survived like weeds in cracks, pushing up despite boots and frost. There was also the act of carrying each other's names. When someone died, the survivors sometimes pledged to remember his name, to speak it later if freedom ever came. "I will carry you," they whispered, meaning not the body, but the memory. And years later, in kitchens and classrooms, in books and testimonies, those names reappeared. Survivors spoke them aloud, fulfilling promises made in the cold. Names became timekeepers, too. "Today is Nikolai's birthday," someone might whisper. Or, "It was 1 year ago today that Maria was taken." These remembrances stitched personal calendars into the monotony of camp time, giving shape to days that otherwise blurred. And there was tenderness in names. In a place where cruelty dominated, tenderness mattered immensely. To call someone by their name, gently, with care, was to remind them of love. It might be the only soft word they heard that week, that month. In those syllables lived warmth, dignity, recognition. One night, a man too weak to rise lay on his bunk, breathing shallowly. His friend sat beside him, repeating his name softly. "Yakov, Yakov." The dying man's lips moved faintly, as if echoing it. When his breath ceased, the name lingered in the barracks, still spoken, still alive. The body had gone, but the name remained, carried by another. For survivors, names became the bridge between past and present. Decades later, when asked what sustained them, many replied, "We remembered names." They could not always recall numbers, not always exact dates, but the names were etched indelibly. To forget would have been to lose everything. To remember was to keep humanity intact. Think of your own life now. Names matter to you too. A mother's, a child's, a friend's, perhaps even a teacher long gone. Say them softly in your mind. Notice how they carry warmth, how they anchor you. In times of calm, they are simply familiar. In times of hardship, they are lifelines. So it was in the camps. Against hunger, against cold, against violence, the prisoners lit candles of solidarity, sang songs, slowed their rhythm, shared bread, and above all, they remembered names. It was the simplest, quietest rebellion, refusing to let the system erase individuality, refusing to let lives vanish entirely. At the end of long days, when exhaustion pressed like stone, names were whispered into the night. They filled the barracks like stars fill a winter sky, each small point shining in the vast dark. One star alone could not banish night, but thousands together made constellations, maps for the weary, guides for the lost. And so the story closes here, in that gentle murmur of remembrance. The camp remains cold, the guards remain cruel, the future uncertain. But the names endure, carried forward. They pass like gifts from one generation to another, from one survivor to another listener. They reach us now in our quiet rooms, reminding us what it meant to endure. The quiet shape of laws. Dim the lights, take a slow breath, and settle your shoulders. Let the room be simple, a small lamp, the hum of a fan, maybe the soft tick of a wall clock. Tonight we step from yesterday's shadows into the steadier light of now, where paper records, open counters, and public rules make a different kind of shelter. In the stories we've walked through, life could change with a knock at 4 a.m. Guilt was decided before the door even opened. Names were reduced to numbers. A rumor could carry a person farther than any train ticket. The past had a way of feeling like weather, cold, total, and beyond argument. But now the tone of ordinary days is changed. Country by country, city by city, and in our own neighborhoods, the expectation is different. There are forms to fill, receipts to keep, doors that say records, clerk, public entrance. It is not glamorous. It is not heroic. It is, in the best way, boring. And boring, after what we have remembered, is a blessing. Consider a simple errand. You stand in a modest office with glass windows and a number in your hand. The clerk calls you by your name, not your case. You present an ID, sign once, then again. A stamp lands on paper with a soft, damp thud. You keep a copy and go home. Behind that tiny ritual stretches a net of laws, deadlines, and procedures that protect both the person at the counter and the person at the window. Someone may still make a mistake. People always will. But the mistake has a trail, and the trail can be retraced. Older neighbors sometimes shake their heads at the fuss, the signatures, the forms, the line that moves one slow step at a time. They whisper that it used to be simpler. Perhaps. But simple in hard times can mean that someone with a baton decides without a record. Simple can be a van without a destination written on any map. We have learned to value the friction of process. It slows a careless decision. It invites a question. It demands a date, a file, a reason in writing. Walk down a main street at dusk. You'll pass a public library with lights like warm squares on the sidewalk. A child presses a book to her chest and hurries after her grandmother. Across the way, a courthouse clock keeps an even time. Its steps have seen weddings and disputes and the plain business of citizenship. On quiet evenings, a maintenance worker wheels a bin through a corridor that smells faintly of lemon oil and paper. A palace of the ordinary. Institutions are not perfect, they never were. But they're kept promises, opening hours posted, notices mailed, rights read aloud. Build a kind of lullaby you can live inside. Laws can sound stern. In memory, they wore dark uniforms and did not listen. But the laws you meet most days are softer around the edges. They are seatbelts and school nurses, fire codes and food dates stamped in ink. They are the right to ask, the right to wait, the right to keep your copy, the right to appeal. They live in school board meetings and town budgets, in the dull debates that end with a vote and a gavel and the scrape of chairs. It is not the drama of midnight, but the comfort of noon. Once, papers were secret. Now, many are posted. Minutes of a meeting, the route of a bus, the plan for a park. These are small lanterns in the civic night. When people can see, they can ask. When they can ask, power must answer. Not always quickly, not always gracefully, but publicly. That alone changes the air we breathe. I think of a museum attendant, smoothing a sheet of mylar over a letter written by a hand long gone. I think of an archivist labeling a box, a name, a year, a place. In another age, those papers might have been burned in a stove or stuffed into a drawer for no one to find. Now, they wait in cool rooms, tidy and still, ready for a granddaughter to open the future with a cotton glove. Law does that in a gentle way. It keeps faith with time, saying that memory deserves a table and a light, and the hush people use in churches. It's true, of course, that no era is free of fear. We still lose our tempers. We still get lost in paperwork. Officials can disappoint us. Mistakes can harden into habits. Yet even disappointment comes with a transcript now. The meeting was recorded. The vote was counted. The rule was written down. In our sleepiest towns and our busiest cities, the dull skeleton of procedure holds the body of daily life upright. That, too, is mercy. If you have ever spent a morning renewing a license, you know the rhythm. The chair that squeaks, the pen chained to the counter, the small triumph of leaving with what you came for. It can feel petty while you're in it. But think of the alternative: a shrug instead of a rule, a threat instead of a fee, a rumor instead of a record. The price of common peace is 1,000 tiny chores. In the old stories, a neighbor's whisper could crush. Today, that whisper meets a boundary. File the form, the clerk says. Bring your proof, the judge says. Let me check the statute, the teacher says. The sound of the present is not a boot at the door, but the quiet patience of, let's see what the policy requires. We may roll our eyes at it, then we sleep easier for it. And yet, memory has work to do in a lawful age. Names still need speaking. Monuments still need sweeping. Children still need to hear why we keep ledgers and open doors and read things aloud. The law is a frame. We must hang real pictures inside it. When we say a name in a public place, when we teach the history behind a plaque, we are training the law to remember its purpose, to guard the person, not merely the rule. This is the gentlest of duties, and it belongs to us all. It happens when a librarian fixes a barcode and also guides a boy to a book about his grandfather's village. It happens when a nurse follows a protocol and also holds a hand for 10 seconds more. It happens when a clerk says, I can't bend the rule, and then adds, but here's how to appeal. Law is lines. Mercy is how we walk them. I have known people who saved their receipts in boxes marked by year and color. I used to smile at the neatness of it. Now I see something tender in those ranks of paper, a life that can be looked up. If someone asks, "Were you here? Did you pay? What did you say?" there is an answer that fits in a palm. The paperwork of peace. How ordinary, how noble. Some evenings, when the house is quiet and the porch light glows on the steps, I imagine a town long ago that never had such comforts. No posted rules, no public desk. A rumor could blow through like a winter wind. In such a place, even a small complaint could draw a large shadow. By the soft light of now, we can see the shape of what has changed. The triangle of citizen, official, and paper, each watching the other, each slowing the hand that might press too hard. We do not need to praise the present too loudly. Loud praise has a way of forgetting. Better to set our gratitude on the table with the mail, folded, daily, steady. Better to tend this garden of rules the way we water houseplants, a little at a time, so they do not grow brittle. The best laws, like the best habits, are cared for quietly. There will be days when the system fails you. A form will be lost. An answer will be late. In those moments, remember that complaint is not the old knock. It is a citizen's instrument. Ask in writing. Keep a copy. Go on record. That is how we honor the memory of those who had no record at all, by insisting gently that we do. And when you finish your tea and click off the lamp, take this with you. We live in an age where the ordinary is a kind of safety. Streets have names and numbers. Offices have hours. Decisions have signatures. A person can be tired or angry or poor and still have a path. It may be narrow. It may be slow. But it is there, and it is lit by fluorescent bulbs and the steady patience of clerks who say, "Next, please." The past taught us to bow our heads under storms. The present asks us to keep our papers dry and our voices calm. Somewhere between those tasks lies the new courage, less dramatic, more durable. It is the courage of staying on the record, of keeping our receipts, of teaching a child what a file number means and why a stamped date matters. These are the thimbles and needles of a lawful life, mending the fabric day by day. So rest now, with that quiet in your pocket, the knowledge that rules can be read, offices can be entered, and names can be spoken aloud without fear. Tomorrow will bring errands and small frustrations. Let them come. Let the day be filled with the gentle friction of a world that insists on writing things down. It is, at last, another kind of lullaby. The ordinary freedom of streets. In the years we've been remembering, a walk down a street could change everything. A knock on the shoulder, a question asked by the wrong uniform, a look held too long. These small accidents could redraw an entire life. A person could vanish between one corner and the next, as though the air itself had swallowed them. Now, the streets carry another mood. You step out your door, lock it with a small twist of metal, and walk toward the bakery or the bus. Your steps echo, not with dread, but with the weight of errands, bread, milk, stamps, an envelope at the post office. The corners hold not soldiers, but lamplight. The benches carry readers, teenagers scrolling their phones, couples with bags of groceries. It is still life, still struggle, but it is not the vanished ground of before. The freedom of streets today is subtle. It is not parade freedom, not fireworks in July, but ordinary freedom, the right to pass, to pause, to be seen, and then forgotten. A man dozing on a bench, a woman waiting for her bus, a child pedaling a small bicycle, all are public, all are safe enough to remain themselves. The law that governs these spaces is invisible, but steady. If an accident happens, sirens come. If a dispute breaks, a record is written. There are witnesses. There are forms. The street no longer swallows without trace. Think of sidewalks as ribbons of trust, each brick or slab laid by hands that believed in continuity. Today we pave, tomorrow we walk, the next day someone else will pass. In the camps of memory, tomorrow was a threat. On modern streets, tomorrow is assumed. You buy bread today trusting there will be bread tomorrow. That assumption is a quiet hymn to stability. Markets are another sign of change. Once, barter was desperate. Bread for boots, a stitch for a spoon, a lie for a ladle of soup. Now, markets are loud with choice. The tomatoes sit beside cucumbers, the shelves carry flour and tea, and the customer holds coins or a card, not fear. Behind the counter is not a guard, but a cashier, whose task is to scan, to smile, to say, "Next, please." It is unremarkable, and that is the miracle. Older ones still tell stories. They point to the wide road and remember when it was empty, but for convoys. They recall standing in line not for fruit, but for news of who had been taken. They walk more slowly now, touching the railings of bridges, watching the faces of passers-by with a kind of disbelief. "Do you know," they whisper, "what it means that we can walk and not fear?" Younger ones often shake their heads, embarrassed by such solemnity. But one day, they too will look back, and the ordinary will shine like treasure. Streetlights are another kind of guardian. Once, darkness was an accomplice of cruelty. Now, light spills from lamps at regular intervals, each with its quiet bulb and hum. A teenager walking home at 9 feels the light on her shoulders. A father pushing a stroller sees the road before him clear. These are not luxuries. They are the slow promises of civic care. Wires hum, bills are paid, bulbs are changed, and the street stays lit. In that light, people breathe easier. And with laws comes accountability. If a car speeds, there is a citation. If a window breaks, there is insurance. If an assault occurs, it is written down, followed up, argued in court. None of this erases pain. None of it makes life fair. But the record itself is a shield. A paper in a folder means the matter does not vanish into rumor. This is how the present differs most deeply. What happens is not erased at dawn. It leaves a mark, and the mark can be traced. On festival days, the streets fill with parades and music. Children wave flags, elders sit on folding chairs, clapping slowly in rhythm. These are public joys, not possible in the past we've recalled. Then, gatherings were watched with suspicion. Now the street itself invites community. Strangers nod to one another. Musicians set up on corners. Laughter flows where once silence reigned. Even at night, when streets are quieter, there is a sense of safety in the repetition of sound. A bus braking, a delivery truck unloading, a cafe stacking chairs. These sounds are not threatening. They are the lullabies of commerce. They say, life continues. You may rest. Someone else takes the next shift. The world will not vanish overnight. To walk a street today is to carry a small inheritance of safety. It was bought at a high price by those who endured when there were no such assurances. And so, every errand, every casual stroll, is a kind of remembrance. Each time you pause at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change, you are practicing trust in the rule, in the driver, in the shared rhythm of city life. The camps took trust away. The present, with its laws and routines, gives it back in teaspoons. A ticket stamped, a receipt handed, a traffic light timed. All are doses of reassurance. And when gathered together, they become a tonic strong enough to quiet the ghosts of fear. So let the streets be ordinary. Let them carry groceries and bicycles, laughter and strollers, tired feet and eager steps. Let the laws that guard them remain unseen but firm. And as you walk them tomorrow, remember the contrast. How far we have come from nights where silence hid danger, to evenings where silence is simply peace. The hearth of home. In every age, people look for warmth. In the hardest winters of the past, warmth was not guaranteed. A stove might stand empty, a fire might be only smoke, a roof might not hold out the snow. Families huddled close, not only for comfort, but for survival. The hearth, if it burned at all, was more than a symbol. It was the fragile center of life. Today, in most homes, warmth is steady. A thermostat clicks softly. Radiators hum. Electric heaters glow with quiet patience. The fire is no longer the line between life and death. It is a choice, a comfort. A family gathers around a television or a dinner table, not because the cold would otherwise consume them, but because it is pleasant to be. Together, this difference between necessity and comfort is one of the greatest gifts of our present age. Think back to the hearth of yesterday. A mother rising before dawn to coax sparks from the ashes, her breath white in the dim room. A child running outside for kindling, hands numb, cheeks red. The fire catching slowly, smoke curling through cracks, eyes watering in the sting. That fire meant survival. Without it, the day would be hunger and frost. With it, there might be soup, dry mittens, a measure of hope. The hearth was also fragile. A wet log, a gust of wind, a shortage of fuel could silence it. In the camps, prisoners dreamed of such hearths, even smoky ones. They remembered the crackle of wood, the glow on a wall, the smell of bread baked close to embers. These memories were warmer than the thin blankets and iron stoves they endured. For them, home meant fire, real or remembered. Now, our homes carry warmth invisibly. Switches and wires and ducts hum beneath our notice. A child may never wonder if tomorrow's firewood will arrive. She will simply tug a blanket closer, pour hot chocolate from a kettle, and fall asleep. We may even complain when the heat is too high, when the air is too dry. But such complaints are luxuries, proof of how far we have traveled from the fragile hearth. And yet, the hearth remains in spirit. Families still gather around a table, a screen, a lamp. Friends still lean toward each other across cups of tea. The fire is not always literal. It is the glow of presence, the warmth of being known. In this way, the hearth has grown, moved from one corner of a house to many. It is in the kitchen where soup simmers, in the living room where stories are told, even in the gentle light of a bedside lamp. Older neighbors sometimes light candles in windows on winter nights. They say it reminds them of the time when a single flame meant safety, meant home. That tiny ritual carries more history than it seems. It is not just decoration. It is memory. It says, "There was a time when this light mattered, and we will not forget it." The law now protects homes in ways once unimaginable. Doors lock with keys that fit only one owner. Addresses are registered. Deeds are written. If someone tries to take a house, there are courts to hear, papers to prove, officials to record. This framework is not perfect, but it is shelter of another kind. It ensures that most fires we tend today are not desperate signals against the night, but chosen comforts. Still, the hearth holds lessons for the present. It reminds us that warmth is never to be taken for granted, that comfort is built from many small tasks: gathering, tending, watching, repairing. In the old days, these tasks were physical. Now they are often bureaucratic: paying the bill, calling the repairman, checking the meter. Different forms, same care. And when we do them faithfully, we honor those who once carried logs through snow simply to keep a flame alive. Imagine your own home tonight, the lamp by your chair, the hum of the refrigerator, the kettle whistling gently. These are modern hearths, speaking the same language as wood smoke once did. You are safe here. You are cared for. You can rest. The details have changed. The message remains. And perhaps that is the deepest difference between past and present. Then the hearth was fragile, always threatened. Now the hearth is resilient, woven into walls, wires, systems, and laws. But the soul of it, the glow, the gathering, the peace, is the same. And so part 3 of our closing rests beside the hearth, once fragile, now steady, always warm in memory. May that warmth follow you into your dreams tonight. Schools and voices. There was a time when voices in classrooms were hushed, not by discipline, but by fear. Children learned quickly that questions could be dangerous, that curiosity might draw suspicion, that knowledge itself could be twisted into accusation. Teachers, weary and watchful, often repeated lessons written far away in distant offices, words they themselves did not fully believe but dared not change. The classroom, which should have been a nest of questions, became instead a hall of silence. Now, classrooms breathe differently. Desks line up in bright rows, chalk dust drifts in sunlight, projectors hum, and children raise their hands freely. They ask with impatience, interrupt with laughter, challenge answers with their own. Teachers encourage not only recall but thought, debate, and experiment. The law protects this exchange. A child who questions is not a threat, but a promise of curiosity carried forward, of democracy renewing itself each year. Think back to the fragile schools of yesterday. Sometimes they were in basements, with windows shuttered and lessons whispered. Sometimes they were in barracks, chalk stubs scrawling across scraps of paper. Children repeated words they barely understood, afraid to misspeak. Names of books disappeared, banned or burned, and whole subjects were erased as though they had never existed. The silence was heavy. It pressed on young minds until imagination itself seemed a risk. Today, books line library shelves with spines unbroken, waiting. History is debated, not erased. Literature is read, not hidden. A child can sit cross-legged on a carpet, page through a picture book, and dream aloud without fear of who listens. The distance between then and now is more than years. It is a change in air itself. The past smelled of dust and secrecy. The present smells of pencils freshly sharpened, of glue on paper, of cafeteria bread. Voices, once suppressed, now echo in assemblies, choirs, debates, school plays. Children rehearse lines, argue mock trials, paint posters for science fairs. The very things once discouraged, expression, invention, imagination, are now the pillars of education. And behind them stand laws, attendance required, rights protected, speech permitted. These laws do not guarantee perfection, but they guarantee a frame where voices can grow. Elders who survived the silences often marvel at today's classrooms. They visit as guests, sitting at the back, listening as students argue with teachers, protest homework, laugh at mistakes. Sometimes tears rise in their eyes. They remember when laughter could be punished, when even a child's slip of the tongue could bring grief to a family. They watch now and see resilience carried forward, not only in memory of suffering, but in the daily practice of free voices. The difference is not only in classrooms, but in public space. A notice board at a town hall, a microphone at a community meeting, a letter to a newspaper, all are voices made public without penalty. What once required whispers in private kitchens now takes place under fluorescent lights in rooms open to all. The very act of disagreement has become ordinary. People argue over taxes, parks, and bus routes. They scowl, they clap, they write letters of protest, and then they go home, safe. That ordinary cycle is a quiet miracle. Schools teach this cycle. They teach children not only facts, but habits of voice. To say, I disagree, to ask why, to write essays defending a view. Each homework assignment is a rehearsal for citizenship. Each science project, each debate, each book report strengthens the muscle of expression. Where once silence bred fear, now practice breeds resilience. And yet, the memory of silence lingers like an undertone. It is what makes today's noise precious. The chatter in hallways, the rush of voices after a bell, the squeak of sneakers and slam of lockers. These are not just sounds of youth. They are sounds of a future that will not be silenced so easily again. They remind us that freedom is not quiet. It is noisy, messy, demanding. And it begins in classrooms where questions are welcomed rather than punished. Picture tonight, if you will, a school after hours. The desks are empty, the lights dimmed, but chalk diagrams remain on boards, posters of explorers hang on walls, and the faint smell of crayons lingers. Tomorrow, children will return, voices tumbling over one another, eager and unafraid. That is the triumph of the present age, the guarantee that voices will not be locked away, that schools will not be reduced to silence, that curiosity will be treated not as crime, but as birthright. The rhythm of daily life. There was a time when daily life could not be trusted. The rhythm of morning and evening, of meals and work, of family errands and rest. These were fragile things, easily broken by a knock at the door or a command shouted from the street. People lived with an ear bent toward danger, their days shaped more by fear than by choice. Now, daily life moves differently. Its rhythm is steady, familiar, sometimes even dull. That dullness is not failure, it is triumph. To wake, to eat, to work, to return, to rest. These are ordinary gifts, unnoticed until they are gone. The heartbeat of the present is measured in buses arriving on schedule, in groceries waiting on shelves, in clocks striking noon while no one trembles. In the hard years, mornings often began with dread. A family might sit to breakfast in silence, each wondering if the father would return from work, if the mother's ration card would still be valid, if the children's names would remain on the school list. Even bread on the table could taste uncertain. And nights were heavier still. The softest sound outside, the bark of a dog, the roll of tires, could freeze the heart. Life was not rhythm, it was rupture. Contrast this with now. You rise to the sound of an alarm clock, grumble perhaps, stretch, and head to the kitchen. Coffee brews, toast pops, a child searches for shoes. The rhythm is predictable, sometimes chaotic, but safely so. A late bus means frustration, not fear. A missed phone call means rescheduling, not vanishing. The rituals of daily life may seem trivial, but they are what freedom feels like from the inside. Work once meant orders without reason, quotas without mercy, punishments without recourse. Now, work carries contracts, paychecks, protections. You may not love your job, but you can leave it. You may disagree with your manager, but you can appeal. Even unemployment comes with documents, offices, applications, small nets to catch those who stumble. The rhythm of labor is steadier now, paced by calendars and laws instead of arbitrary power. Meals, too, reveal the change. In the past, hunger sat at every table, Families stretched scraps into soups, rationed slices, whispered about who had gone without. Today, most homes know the comfort of choice: what to cook, when to eat, how to share. Grocery stores may frustrate with lines or prices, but their shelves testify to abundance once unthinkable. To argue over brands is a privilege. To save leftovers in a refrigerator is a victory. Evenings once closed with fear, curtains drawn tight, lamps dimmed to avoid notice. Conversations were quiet, interrupted by long pauses, ears tuned to footsteps. Now, evenings are filled with television, with phones buzzing, with laughter rising from porches. Neighbors stroll, dogs bark, children play until the streetlights flicker on. The rhythm of night has become communal again, open and unafraid. Older generations carry the contrast most clearly. They sit in armchairs, listening to the hum of appliances, watching children argue over cartoons, and marvel silently. To them, the smallest sounds, the clink of dishes, the ring of a telephone, the slam of a mailbox lid, are reminders that daily life is secure. These sounds would once have been interrupted, stolen, silenced. Now, they repeat faithfully, like verses of a song. The law plays its part. Rent is recorded, bills are mailed, pensions are counted, traffic lights blink in sequence. Each of these things may seem tiresome, but together they form the rhythm of peace. Bureaucracy, dull as it is, ensures that life flows forward without abrupt terror. To fill a form is to step into continuity. To receive mail is to be seen, acknowledged, included. Daily life today is not perfect. Worries still come, arguments still rise, illnesses still strike. But imperfection itself proves the difference. We fret over small things, bills, deadlines, quarrels, because the great fear has receded. The absence of catastrophe is what allows complaint. That, too, is rhythm, the steady drumbeat of survivable troubles. Think tonight of your own day. Perhaps you ran errands, or sat through meetings, or cooked dinner. Perhaps you felt weary of repetition. But imagine the opposite. Days without repetition, each one broken, each one dictated by others. Suddenly, the ordinary shines. Suddenly, the routine feels holy. The rhythm of daily life is the quietest inheritance we hold. It does not parade. It does not boast. It hums beneath our feet, steady and sure, like the tick of a clock in a hallway. We may not hear it until silence threatens, but it is there, and it carries us. And so part 5 of our closing rests in the gentle rhythm of daily life, once fragile, now steady. May its quiet drumbeat carry you through the night and into morning, safe and whole.